Despite reaching the playoffs last year, even reaching the NFC Championship playoff game against the Philadelphia Eagles, the 49ers are arguably the most overlooked playoff team going into the 2023 season. And the big reason of that has to be that Brock Purdy, their starting quarterback, tore his UCL in that game and hasn't even started throwing yet and is expected to start throwing in about 10 days in early June. And while it's encouraging that Brock Purdy will start to throw in June, there's a whole bunch of other reasons why the 49ers could be one of the deadliest teams entering this year. One of the most important factors to look at when building a championship team that can carry you over to the Super Bowl is the defense. And the Niners have been one of the best teams at building their defense for years. But there was a major change this offseason when their former defensive coach, DeMeco Ryans, left for a job in Houston. But they were able to bring in a fantastic coach in Steve Wilks. And Wilks is going to transform the 49ers defense by incorporating a lot more blitzes, making the 49ers a much more aggressive defense, and will probably run a lot more man and press. This will hopefully lead to more sacks and turnovers for the 49ers. The strength of the San Francisco team for years have been the front seven, specifically the defensive line. As many people know, you have Nick Bosa, arguably the best defensive player in the league. Bumping it inwards, the 49ers were able to bring in Javon Hargrave, the best defensive tackle on the free agency market. They also have Eric Armstead, who looked to be a solid contributor last year. And then finally, on the edge, you have many people competing for that edge spot, but someone that Steve Wilks mentioned multiple times in his presser was Drake Jackson, who looks to make a jump in year 2. Right now in the linebacking core for the Niners, they have 2 proven linebackers in Fred Warner and Dre Greenlaw, but they've also added depth this offseason, drafting Dee Winters as well as Jalen Graham. Jalen Graham stood out in rookie camp and kind of stood above Dee Winters, despite Dee Winters having a blistering fast 40-yard time. There's also Marcelino McCrary-Ball, who the 49ers were able to pick up as an undrafted free agent last year, and he looks to have developed in the 49ers defensive scheme and may be able to take over for Azeez Al-Shaair. This front seven and the linebacking core must be excited to work with Steve Wilks, because, as I mentioned, he's one of the most aggressive defensive coordinators across the entire league. And to me, this is going to be an increase in production of sacks for the defensive line and linebackers. Speaking of Steve Wilks, however, he's also probably the best secondary coach across the entire NFL. And his secondary is also usually different than what the 49ers run consistently. The 49ers usually run a ton of zones because that leads to the Niners not getting beat deep and really not allowing too many big plays. But it also prevents them from making a whole lot of plays the opposite way. However, Steve Wilks is looking to increase the amount of press man and the ball hawks he has in his secondary. And he's done that a couple of ways this offseason. First, by bringing in their starting nickel back, it looks like, in Isaiah Oliver. The Niners were also able to bring in some players that will be able to fit Steve Wilks' defensive scheme a little bit better in the draft. The first player I want to talk about is Darrell Luter Jr. He's a cornerback, but even though the 49ers got him later in the draft, he looks like he'd be able to possibly start for him. In rookie minicamp, he shut down everyone despite not being able to use his arms in press man coverage. And when he's on the field, he looks like an extremely comfortable and confident corner that will be able to get up in most wide receivers' faces and lock them down. And while it may take Luter a year or two to develop in this lockdown corner, I think eventually he will be a solid NFL starter. But there's also another player who could jump in this year and make an immediate impact on the defensive secondary, and that guy is Ji'Ayir Brown. I think he should have been picked up way earlier in the draft. He was one of the most productive safeties across the entire NCAA. He had 10 interceptions his last 2 years, which is outstanding. And despite not testing the best, Ji'Ayir Brown plays extremely quick when he's playing and is able to make a ton of plays. He's an aggressive tackler and fits everything the Niners want in the safety position. He's a true ball hawk and may even push Tashawn Gibson for the starting job this year. Under Steve Wilks, I imagine the Niners defense is going to be a much more explosive defense, capitalizing on the aggressive nature and also the press man coverage that Steve Wilks looks to implement in the 49ers defense much more. And while at the beginning of the season, it may take a while to transition, I think by the time playoffs come, the Niners will have arguably a better defense than they did this year. Speaking of getting stronger, the Niners got stronger at their kicking position, and I just mean physically stronger because Robbie Gould is arguably one of the best kickers in NFL history, and the Niners had to replace him this year in the draft with Jake Moody. Jake Moody does have a bigger leg than Robbie Gould, so the Niners should be able to make a little bit longer field goals, and also they should be able to get more touchbacks during their kickoffs. This is great because their punter Mitch Wishnowsky does not handle kickoff duties. Jake Moody was also arguably the best kicker in college history. The Niners were also able to bring in Ronnie Bell, who offers depth at the returning position behind Ray McCloud. So overall, on the special team side, I think the Niners stayed the same or maybe even got a tiny bit better. Moving over to the offensive side of the ball, the offensive line is the biggest factor probably for most teams. And this year, the Niners lost Mike McGlinchey in free agency, but they do look to start probably Colton McKivitz at right tackle. And they said they have a ton of faith in them. And the last time they said that in Aaron Banks, and then also they were able to start Spencer Burford last year, they both look solid. And I have a ton of faith in Chris Forrester. He's able to continually show that he knows what he's talking about on the offensive lineman. He even did this in the center position with Jake Brendel. On the skill positions for the Niners, this is where they've always stood out, especially looking at their versatility. They have Deebo Samuel, who's a wide receiver and a running back. They also have Christian McCaffrey, who's arguably the best receiving running back in the league. And they have a true number one wide receiver in Brandon Ayuk and the best versatile tight end in George Kittle. And that's not even to mention guys like Kyle Juszczyk or Juwan Jennings. They also have a ton of guys developing underneath them, including Ronnie Bell, who I mentioned, but also last year's third-round draft pick in Danny Gray, who has a blistering 40 time of 4.3 seconds. It's also worth noting that Niners players usually get considerable more action in year 2, so watch out for Gray to be a burner this year. Finally, we need to speak about the quarterback position for the Niners. They only have 2 healthy quarterbacks right now, Trey Lance and Sam Darnold. Brock Purdy, like I said, may come back and start this season, but right now his health is unknown. So to put Brock Purdy aside, we should speak about Trey Lance and his development this offseason. Specifically, let's see what one of the best players across the entire NFL said about him in Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes said that he thinks the world of Trey Lance, and he's not the only one who's come out and spoke highly of Trey Lance this offseason. His coach Kyle Shanahan also said Trey Lance looks the best he's ever looked in a 49ers uniform. And the big reason for that is that Trey Lance is finally healthy. Not only his ankle, but also his finger is healthy. Trey Lance also changed his throwing coach to the same one Patrick Mahomes uses in Jeff Christensen. And this looks to be paying dividends this offseason as Trey Lance no longer suffers from arm fatigue and also looks to have a much more compacted and efficient throwing motion. So while many people are counting out the Niners for the Super Bowl, I think the Niners are one of the deadliest teams, mainly thanks to their defense, and Steve Wilks is probably going to kick that into high gear. And then moving on to the offensive side of the ball, the special players have to be the skill players like Christian McCaffrey, Deebo Samuel. So if it's Brock Purdy who's able to start at quarterback, that's great. But if Trey Lance is the one to take over, I wouldn't be surprised if he set the entire league on fire. But those are just my thoughts on the Niners being one of the deadliest teams headed into this season. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. It would also mean a ton to me if you guys liked and subscribed. Thank you guys so much for watching. It truly means a ton to me.